Yeah, so we're in this series of storytelling over the summer, of hearing people's stories, just heard Sam and Mike's, but also looking at how we can tell better stories with our own lives. And for that, this morning, we are going to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and Laura is going to read that for us
now. So, concerning change of status, verse 17, nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when God called them.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. And apologies. You only found out this morning just how many times you'd have to say the word circumcision this morning. Apologies for that. We are looking at this whole thing of storytelling and how we can tell better stories with our own lives. And today we're going to look at this idea of the roles that we play. And I'll start off with a bit of an observation, and that is that two different actors or actresses can play the same role and bring something really different to it. So let's start off with Sherlock, for example. A ton of different people have played Sherlock Holmes over the years, but two of the recent examples have been Benedict Cumberbatch and Robert Downey Jr. So Robert Downey Jr.'s was much more kind of comedy, slapstick, fun, very RDJ, like his kind of way of doing things. Benedict Cumberbatch's was way more gritty, realistic, kind of showed the sides of addiction and all of that kind of thing. So two actors bringing their own kind of unique energies to a role and ended up making it something very different altogether. And then when I was asking Lizzie about, what would she think about in terms of comparing two different actors who played the same role, she went to the controversial subject of Pride and Prejudice and who gets to play Elizabeth Bennet. So for her, definitively, it's all about the BBC version from when she was growing up and Jennifer L, who played that. And more recently, doesn't feel like Keira Knightley was well cast as Elizabeth Bennet and maybe didn't give the role what it needed. So, as two different actors or actresses play the same role, they can do it very differently, but they also can do it, better or worse, arguably, depending where you sit on the whole Pride and Prejudice debate. And so it is for the roles that we play in life. We bring our own kind of energies and selves to it, and we can do it in really different ways. And when we're talking about roles, we're talking about the things that we fulfill in life. So we're talking about, wife, father, business owner, sister, writer, creative, athlete, accountant, teacher, Christian, friend, you name it, all the different things, the relationships that we fulfill and the things that we do in the world. That's what we're talking about. And typically speaking, most of us should be able to write out all of our main roles in about 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 different roles that we fulfill in life. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about roles, those different things that we do and the relationships that we fulfill in life. Now, as we started off the whole thing today, who would you want to play you in your life? Who, if they stepped into your shoes and played the role of your life, you think would bring a really good kind of energy to it? And then could you imagine different actors or actresses fulfilling that role in the different kind of ways that they would do it? So, I said earlier, John Krasinski, got him nailed on to play the role of me in my life. I just need to work on making my own life kind of movie worthy, so there's a bit to do there. But, if I manage to do that, do something extraordinary, then maybe John would be available to play me. And it's one of the things we say a lot at Storyhouse is kind of, what would Jesus do if he had your life? If Jesus was to play the role of you in the film of your life, what would that look like? What energy would he bring to it? How would he play that role out for you? And that is exactly what our passage is about today. And our key verse from our passage today is from 1 Corinthians 7:17. Each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned them to and which God has called them to. What this is talking about is that God has put two callings on our life, assigned by the Lord, called by God. And one of those callings is to follow Jesus, to be a Christian. That's what he calls every human being who's ever lived to do, is to come follow Jesus. Jesus made that invite a general invite, whether you've taken up that invitation or not yet. That invitation stands for every human being who has ever lived to come and follow Jesus. So that's the one we think is obvious, and when we think of when we talk about God's calling on our life to come and follow Jesus, that seems really obvious. But interestingly, it says that God has given us a second calling, or assignment, as the NIV puts it, and that is the roles we play in life. And so written to these people 2,000 years ago, they had, some were wives, some were slaves. They're two of the people that this is written to. Others headed up households. Some had enormous businesses. Some, were right at the bottom of the social ladder. Everyone had these different roles to play in life. And what it's saying, really interestingly, is not only has God called you to follow Jesus, which they knew about, but he also placed you exactly where you are. That is part of God's call on your life. Now, this doesn't mean that you are forever locked into those roles. And, part of this passage is actually talking to slaves at the time, saying, if you get your chance for freedom, go for it, type thing. But, more or less, you can fulfill the following of Jesus in either of those circumstances. So it's not saying wherever you are and whatever you do right now is locked in for the rest of your life, but it is saying that God put you where you are right now, and that is the place where you are to follow Jesus. So, another way of putting this is God has put a call on your life to follow Jesus, but he has also given you a context in which to follow that out. And this is one of those things that just blew my mind when I was reading this passage and thinking about what it said to us today, is that, we're so individualistic in the West, and we're so used to kind of sectioning off all the different parts of our lives that we can think of ourselves as, being Christians as a kind of private thing or a personal thing or an inward thing. And that it's us that become a Christian. The technical term for this is sanctification. That, Jesus makes us holy and pure. That's what we looked at in Ephesians. Everyone who follows Jesus is a saint. It's a new designation that's given to us, but also that we live into that new identity, that we become holy people. We become people who are like Jesus. But here's the amazing thing, is that if we choose to follow Jesus, it's not just us that gets sanctified, become holy, become like Jesus, but every connection that we have, all of our roles, our role as a mother, as a father, as a child, as a brother, as a sister, as someone who temps in an office, someone who's a teacher or a doctor, or, all of these roles also got sanctified, also became a Christian alongside us. Jesus is transforming the whole thing. Not just us and our private lives, but all of our connections and all of the things that we do in the world. It's not just Jesus in our heart. It's Jesus in our roles. It's Jesus, as a family member, as a friend, as whatever job you have or things that you do in the world. If you are a business owner and you become a Christian, it's not just you privately sectioned off over there that becomes a Christian, but also your role as a business owner is now forever changed by Jesus as well. If you became a Christian in your family, your relationships are never going to be the same again. How you relate to the rest of your family has changed. You now relate to them as Jesus would relate to them, and same in your friendship groups. Or, if an important part of you is your creative output, if you've got a particular hobby that you do, if you love gardening or painting or creating, whatever it is, or you're really into your music, that also got baptized when you got baptized, if you have been baptized and you choose to follow Jesus. Or if you've not made that decision yet, know that it's going to be the whole of your life that comes under Jesus and not just the private bits of it. And that is exactly what is happening in this passage here, 1 Corinthians 7. Is Paul is writing to this church that he founded, and he's writing to people in a few different situations, but the big one is there are people who are withdrawing from their marriages for a couple of reasons. One is because they're married to non-Christians and they think that they can't do that as a Christian. And the other one is that people think that the celibate life is more holy than the married life. Like, married life is second place. And interestingly, this has actually generally been the default position of Christianity throughout history, is that single celibate people are more holy than people who are married. And it's only in the last kind of couple of hundred years, especially in the Protestant part of the church, that the thing swung the other way. And we decided that, it's only people who are married who are really living the good life and all that kind of thing. But this passage endorses neither of those sides and actually says, bloom where you are planted, follow Jesus where you are planted, whether that's in your marriage or outside of it, whether that's in a marriage where, you're both Christians or just one of you are, because there was all kinds of mixed marriages at the time, because quite often it was the women who were becoming Christians and the husbands weren't. Back in the day, if the husband became a Christian, quite often the rest of the family household would do as well. Won't get sidetracked into that, but a very common situation early on was women who were becoming Christians, and the rest of the household wasn't, and there was questions around what that meant for them, and that's what this was written to. But there's also, as we have seen, there's a form of slavery at the time, which is different than the slavery that we know. It still wasn't a good thing, but it was very different. It was bond servants. So people who are equivalent would be people who are on minimum wage, like right at the bottom of the social ladder, but you could work your way out of that and become a freed person, which this passage also talks to. And, some people, because they've been given freedom in Christ, felt that they could no longer be bond servants. They could no longer be at the bottom of the social ladder, essentially owned by a family or by a person. And what Paul is saying is, like, whether you're free or not, you can follow Jesus in both of those circumstances. And actually, wherever you were when Jesus called you, that's where he called you to. And interestingly, he says, basically the setting is almost irrelevant because Jesus has turned everything over. And he picks on two of the biggest barriers that there were in the world at the time. So there was the social barrier, free people and bond servants or slaves, and then the religious barrier of the circumcised and uncircumcised. And he takes these two big barriers, one social, one religious, the biggest two barriers that the church would have experienced, and said, basically, it's irrelevant. You can follow Jesus wherever you are. No one job is more important or more holy than another job. No one religious standing is more or less important than another. Now, when Paul, that might not sound like nothing to us, or quite pleasant or quite progressive or modern or whatever. But when Paul was writing it, that would have been incredibly scandalous. To say that circumcision or uncircumcision was irrelevant was incredibly shocking, because to the Jewish people that Paul was writing to, circumcision was everything. It was the sign, the physical sign of the covenant between God and his people. It's what separated them out. It was what showed that they belonged to God, and God was, they were God's people. But Paul had his life transformed by his own call. Paul was a persecutor of the church. He was trying to stamp Christianity out. And then on his journey to go arrest some Christians, Jesus spoke to him directly from heaven. He was blinded by this light. He heard these words from Jesus from heaven. And that changed everything for him, because he knew that at the very moment where he was trying to stamp out the church, Jesus called him to follow him. So Paul had tried his whole life to be religiously perfect, to follow all of the rules, to have all of the symbols, all of the belonging that he could. And it's actually in spite of that, or despite all of his persecution, that Jesus spoke into his life and called Paul, of all people, to follow him. And so Paul knew that you could not add anything to this gospel of Jesus. You couldn't add anything to the cross of Jesus, that it was pure gift, pure grace by which Jesus calls people to follow him. And therefore, any religious distinctives no longer mattered. So we might want to update this and say, like, literally, it does not matter if you have been a Christian for a day or if you are the Archbishop of Canterbury. It is all grace, and there is no distinction between the two. It really doesn't matter. One is not more holy than the other. All are called under Jesus. And then the social barriers, saying, again, really scandalously, in a world in which you are either a bondservant, a slave, and essentially were owned by someone else, and you could eventually work your way out of it, or you were a freed person, which gave you, all kinds of rights and extra status. So very deliberately picking up on people who had, like, bottom of the barrel, zero status in society, and those who were free and could determine their future and had all of this status and all of these rights, and said there's no difference between the two of you. So today, Paul might write to someone who is on benefits and someone who is a CEO and say there's no difference between the two of you. What matters is Jesus and following him wherever you are. And, and that is the implication of this. And he says it in 3 verses in this short passage. So verse 17, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to them and to which God has called them. And then verse 20, each one should remain in the situation in which they were when God called them. And then finally, verse 24, each one, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation to which God has called them. So 3 times in a short passage, stay where you are, stay where you are, stay where you are, because wherever you are and whatever you do in life, that is what God has called you to. And, there is not a more holy vocation out there or something that's going to give you any more status than everything you already have. So, you can't go and do something that will make you, more holy, more religious. Someone who does a job like me is not more holy than Mike, who works in the hospital, or Sam in the various roles she does around the home and at work and all those kind of things. That there is no difference. What matters is whether you do those things for Jesus or not. And then in terms of status, there is nothing to be earned from climbing the social ladder or climbing the career ladder. One job does not have any more status than any other, because what matters is whether you do those things in Jesus or not. So if social standing doesn't count and religious standing doesn't count, what does count? Well, the answer is given to us in verse 19. Circumcision is nothing, so religious standing is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. So not your standing in society or your relationship status or your job status, but obedience is what matters. It would be really easy to take the thinking of a passage like this and go, okay, religious standing doesn't count, social standing doesn't count, might as well lay back and do nothing. Whatever I do doesn't count anymore. And to counter that, Paul puts this sentence right in the middle of this passage saying, but something does matter. And that is obeying God's commands, following the way of Jesus, doing what Jesus would do in those different roles of your life. It matters how you do your life. The way that you do your life does matter. So while the world might have a ladder of importance and status, this person's more important than that person, Jesus does not have that. Instead, what he is looking for is obedience. And that is the proper response to this free gift that Jesus gave us. It's a line from Tim Keller that I've always found really helpful, is that essentially the order is everything. Religion says, if you obey and you're a really good person, then you will belong. But Jesus comes and says, you belong. And so therefore we obey. Jesus welcomes us into the family. And so therefore we take on the family likeness. It's not allowing us in once we've reached a certain moral standard, but we are in. And so therefore we live up to that standard that we have been given. And, if we put all of this together, that, ordinary life is the place where discipleship happens, and it can't happen anywhere else. That's what Jesus is saying, is like, I have called you to follow me, and I've given you the place where you are to do it. And that is essentially saying you don't have anywhere else to do discipleship other than the roles that you fulfill in your family, amongst your friendships, and at work. That is where your discipleship happens. And if it only happens on a Sunday, and if it only happens on midweek on Zoom, if they're the only places where Jesus comes into your life, then you are not following Jesus, because he gave you the place to follow him. And that is in your friendships, family, your roles, your job, everything you do in life. That's where you follow Jesus. So if ordinary, everyday life is where discipleship happens, and if it's obedience is the thing that really counts, then we put those together and we find that it is obedience to Jesus, being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, doing what he did in the ordinary reality is what changes the world. And that sounds like over the top, sounds like hyperbole, but it's literally what happened. The church was a bunch of nobodies from nowhere, kind of with no social standing, no real money, certainly no power behind them. And all it was a movement of people following Jesus in their everyday lives. And it grew like no movement has ever done before or since. No movement has grown that quickly, affected that many different people from so many diverse backgrounds and cultures, hasn't transformed so many things as that has. The church went from a group of nobodies, an obscure part of the world, to the greatest movement that the world had ever known in just 300 years. And it wasn't done through power moves. And you can look into the history of this, and there's some fascinating books on it. It wasn't done through power. It wasn't done through money. It wasn't done through influence. It was done by ordinary people living like Jesus in the very settings to which Jesus had called them in their everyday lives. So if you think about the roles that you fulfill, maybe, 4 or 5 of them, a role within family and friendship, at work, all those kind of things, your role at church, that is no accident. And no one else can be like Jesus in that role other than you. Jesus has called you to that place and to be like Jesus in that place. And as we said before, that might change throughout your life, but the main thing is dealing with where Jesus has put you today and following him right there. And Jesus has transformed each of those roles, each of those relationships, so that you can be like him in that role. So, for example, for myself, top of my list is disciple of Jesus. You can call that whatever you want, being a Christian, whatever. Second is being a husband. Then it's being a friend and family member, and then it's being a church minister, my other role in life. And the order is really important in this. So one is clarity. One is knowing which few roles can I do well? Because if you wrote 10 roles down, for example, you're a single human being and you cannot do all of those things well. So we need to get clarity. We need to get that list down to the few things that we can do well. So I've got like 4 or 5 roles when I write it down, because that's all that I can do well. I can't do more than that well. And then really important is to put Jesus at the top of that list, but not just at the top of the list, really encompassing the whole list. When we were listening to Mike and Sam before describe their life and juggling all these different roles while being Christians, what was really interesting was, like, for Mike, it was important to have some sharp lines between those things. So not to bring work home with him, and to make sure that he left work at the right time. But those lines didn't exist when it came to faith. And that's really important, because following Jesus transforms every single one of those. So it's not just that, following Jesus at the top of the list. Like, it is the list. Everything is following Jesus. This idea is called ordered loves. Jesus put it really simply. He said, the 2 greatest commandments were to love the Lord your God with all that you are first, and then to love your neighbor, whoever you come across, as yourself. And it was important that those 2 be followed in order. One allowed the other. And so it is that our lists come in a certain order. And most of the big regrets in life around the roles that we play is when we get them in the wrong order. Super common at the end of life, or hopefully before life, to hear people say how much they regret elevating work above family. That's a super common one. And that's all about the ordering of things. We have to have a job. That's really important. That's an important part of who we are. We're meant to create and produce and put things into the world. But when that becomes more important than our friends and family relationships, things go wonky. And if God is not on the top and surrounding that list, then the whole thing doesn't work at all. So this whole idea of getting clarity on the roles that we play and making sure that every single one of them is about following Jesus wherever we are helps people at both ends of life. So at the first half of life, in your 20s and maybe up to your mid 30s, where you're trying to find some meaning in life and you are trying to find some purpose and some direction, this passage comes to us and says, no matter what you do, literally no matter what you do, whether that's working in McDonald's or running a company, it can be deeply meaningful, and it will be deeply meaningful if you do it for Jesus. If you bring the presence of Jesus into that place, it will be meaningful, which really challenges the gospel of upward mobility that our culture has, that you have to be doing the thing you love and you have to be rising up in it and getting better and better at it, and then that's when you'll find fulfillment. This passage comes along and says, no, whatever you do can be deeply meaningful if you do it for Jesus. In the other half of life, kind of mid-30s onwards or earlier for some people, this reminds us that we have limits, that we aren't supposed to be all things to all people, but actually we just do a few things well. We're not meant to be burning out and pushing ourselves beyond our limits. God created us finite, and God gave us a garden to tend to. God gave us a few roles to do, and we are supposed to attend to those few things well and not overreach our natural boundaries and burn ourselves out and work too hard and end up frustrated and stressed, but rather just do the few things that God has already given us well. And if we're faithful in those few things, Jesus might give us some more things down the road, but that's not for us to worry about, just the things that Jesus has put in front of us for now. So what if Jesus was cast in the role of your life? How would he play those different roles? What would he bring to them? I find it really interesting that I was listening to a leadership podcast, and it was exploring the different levels of leadership and how some leaders bring about the biggest change in their organizations. And this was based on lots and lots of research. And the thing that was really interesting about it was basically the base level of leadership, like the least effective way to influence others and bring about positive change, was to insist upon your job title. That's basically the bottom rung, is to say, I'm more important than you, therefore you have to do what I say. And good leaders very seldom have to call upon that base level of leadership. And that's doubly interesting when you consider Jesus, who never had an official title. People called him rabbi, but that was an informal title. It just meant he was a teacher. People recognized him as a good teacher and followed him around because of that, as someone who trained other people up. He had no official status, had no business card, had no organization to point to and say, I belong to that. And yet he was the most influential person who ever lived. Which again lends itself to this idea that no matter what it is that you do, wherever God has put you, wherever your social standing might be, it can be deeply meaningful. It can be transformed if you bring the presence of Jesus into that role.